Imagine a man whose name alone was enough to make entire ship crews surrender. A man who walked out of the fog with smoking fuses in his beard and became the symbol of piracy. Blackbeard. But who was he really? And how did Edward Teach become one of the most feared pirates in history? Chapter 1. How it all started. Edward Teach, also spelled Thatch, was born around 1680 in Bristol, England. Not much is known about his youth, which either comes down to poor record-keeping back then, or because it just wasn't all that exciting. What we do know, Teach was in the right place at the right time. Or, if you ask later merchant ships, exactly the wrong place at the wrong time. Around 1701, the War of the Spanish Succession broke out. A global mess of throne claims, power struggles, and colonies. For young sailors like Teach, that meant work, loot, and the license to plunder. In the form of a letter of marque from the British Crown. Officially, that didn't make him a pirate. He was a privateer. Basically, a pirate with a permission slip. His first known command was probably over a small sloop. These ships were light, fast, nimble, with just one mast, a few cannons, but perfect for quick raids and sneaky get-awards when things got dicey. Teach sailed under the British flag in the Caribbean, and it was there, somewhere between Jamaica and Hispaniola, that, around 1716, he crossed paths with one of the most notorious men at sea, Benjamin Hornigold. There's no record of any dramatic handshakes or cinematic beach meetings. But one thing's for sure. Hornigold saw more in Teach than just a gutsy rookie with a beard. He saw leadership potential. Teach joined his crew, starting out as a regular officer, but within a few months, his rank was about to change big time. At the time, Hornigold was kind of like a pirate mentor with an entrepreneurial streak. He pulled off successful raids, trained up new captains, and, surprisingly often, preached against attacking British ships. A principled pirate, if you will. With Hornigold, Teach also made it to New Providence. More specifically, the port town of Nassau, which was soon to become the unofficial capital of the pirate world. See, after Nassau was sacked by the Spanish in 1703 and more or less abandoned, it turned into what you might call today an anarchist startup paradise, only with less Wi-Fi and way more rum. The pirates set up their own rules, democratic votes, equal shares of the loot, elected captains, and surprisingly little internal violence, as long as you stuck to the code. Nassau was chaotic, sure, but it wasn't aimless. It was the perfect breeding ground for men like Teach, who knew how to use both a sword and his brain. And Teach stood out for his courage, discipline, and his knack for getting people to rally behind him. Eventually, Hornigold handed him command of his own sloop, a sign of trust that also marked the start of Teach's solo career. Nobody knew at the time that this quiet rise was the first step in creating a legend, a name that would soon be spoken in every dockside tavern, with a mix of fear, respect, and a swig of rum. Blackbeard. Chapter 2. Stede Bonnet's Bitter Lesson. Stede Bonnet was born around 1688 on the island of Barbados, smack in the middle of the British Empire, surrounded by sugar plantations, colonial wealth, and, sadly, the ever-present slave trade. His parents were English settlers, and they were loaded. We're talking land, property, the whole package. So more upper class than below deck, if you know what I mean. When his dad died, Bonnet inherited a big plantation with all the bells and whistles, including the kind of responsibilities you had as a young man with status and money. Start a family, play your part in society, and keep it respectable. He married a woman named Mary Allenby. They had 3 or maybe 4 kids. The sources can't seem to agree. And they lived a life that sounded more like a tea party than a pirate raid. But why the hell would a guy like that become a pirate? Well, and this is where it gets interesting. Because nobody really knows why Bonnet suddenly got fed up with his fancy life. Was it a midlife crisis? A stressful marriage? Some sources claim his wife was kind of a handful. Or just plain old wanderlust. Historians agree on one thing. Bonnet wasn't happy. And not just a little. He was so fed up that in 1717, with 0 sailing experience, he went and bought himself a ship. Didn't steal it. Didn't hijack it. Nope, he bought it. Like a gentleman. The Revenge became his ship. And the crew? He hired them like staff for an estate, with salaries instead of violence. No joke. The first guys on board were basically employees. Bonnet actually didn't know squat about sailing. He'd never worked as a sailor, never been in a real battle. But somehow, he managed to capture his first ships anyway, with books in his captain's cabin and polite words on deck. At first, Bonnet just kind of drifted along the American East Coast. From the Carolinas up to Virginia, he snagged a few small merchant ships, nothing crazy, but enough to make him feel like a real pirate. His tactics were, let's say, improvised. The Revenge, his bought and paid for ship, was solid and packed with about 10 cannons. Nothing to scoff at. But Bonnet himself knew about sailing about as much as a priest knows about sword fighting. His decisions were all over the place. His course was unpredictable, which became a problem for both his crew and his targets. And then came the big blow. In the summer of 1717, the Revenge ran into a Spanish warship during one of its raids. A frigate, battle-hardened and way more firepower. Bonnet, maybe out of some misguided heroism, or just because he didn't know any better, decided to take it on. The Revenge was thrown into a brutal fight almost immediately. The Spanish frigate opened fire with precise volleys. Cannonballs tore through the planks, shredded the rigging, and filled the deck with smoke and splinters. Bonnet himself was badly wounded, probably by a musket ball or a piece of shrapnel that hit his side. Historical accounts mention at least one nasty, gaping wound in his torso that almost killed him. His crew, who'd never really been sold on their gentleman captain to begin with, fought, sure, but without any clear direction. Many men fell in the hail of bullets. Others took the chaos as their cue to bail when it became clear their captain wasn't going to make it. By the end of it, about a third of the crew was either dead, seriously wounded, or just straight up gone. Despite the loss, the survivors somehow managed to get the damaged ship out of danger. It wasn't exactly a heroic retreat, more like a desperate sail away with tattered sails and a shell-shocked crew. Bonnet himself was unconscious, bleeding, and in serious need of medical help. They had no choice but to head for New Providence, more specifically, Nassau in the Bahamas. The pirate stronghold where lawlessness was just part of daily life, and rum was cheaper than bread. That's where Bonnet sought safety, healing, and, as fate would have it, crossed paths with a man who would change his life forever. Edward Teach. Chapter 3. The Queen Anne's Revenge. In late autumn of 1717, while Europe was busy negotiating treaties, France was recovering from wars, and the Caribbean simmered like a powder keg at sea. A French ship called La Concorde was on its way back home, marked by disease, losses, and a grim business. La Concorde wasn't your average merchant ship. She was part of the infamous triangle trade, textiles and weapons from Nantes to Africa, human cargo from Ouida to the Americas, and then sugar, tobacco, and gold back to Europe. On March 24, 1717, she set sail from the French port of Nantes. On board, a crew of 75 men, 16 cannons for defense, and a dark mission. Destination: the so-called Slave Coast, specifically Ouida in what's now Benin. On July 8, 1717, it happened. 516 African men, women, and children were loaded onto the ship like livestock. Cramped below deck, barely able to move, death a constant presence. But the crew paid their price too. Scurvy, dysentery, the heat, all of it wore them down, killing both men and morale. By the time La Concorde turned toward the Caribbean, barely 40 of the original 75 crew were still fit to work. Over 60 of the enslaved were already dead. Their next stop, Martinique. That's where the roughly 455 surviving slaves were supposed to be sold. From there, the ship would sail back to France, loaded with colonial goods. A cruel cycle, over and over again. But fate had other plans. On November 28, 1717, off the tiny Caribbean island of St. Vincent, a ship appeared on the horizon. No, 2 ships. On one sloop, small, fast, with 8 cannons, was Benjamin Hornigold. On the other, a certain Edward Teach. Bigger, faster, scarier. With 2 precise broadsides, Teach kicked things off. La Concorde, already crippled and barely able to defend herself, surrendered quickly. No heroic fight, no dramatic boarding, just a battered French ship staring reality in the face. The French captain, Pierre Dosset, gave in. Teach took the ship, dropped the crew off on the nearby island of Bequia, including the weakened survivors. But 10 men, including the navigator, the carpenter, a cook, and the ship's doctor, were recruited. Whether they volunteered or not, they became part of Edward Teach's new crew. What happened to the slaves? Good question, and one that still puzzles historians today. Most likely, they were left behind on Bequia. There's evidence that about 394 people were dropped there, The rest remains a mystery. But now, the real chapter begins. The birth of the Queen Anne's Revenge. Teach didn't rebuild the ship right away, like you might think. Instead, he started using it immediately. Already by December, he was back to piracy. The refit happened gradually, along the way, probably at several stops, including Tortuga, Bequia, and even New Providence. And what did he change? A whole lot. The original 16 cannons were swapped out for up to 40 heavy guns, British, French, and Swedish models. The rigging was redone, the hull reinforced, with lead plates for sealing. The former slave ship became a fully armed frigate. The deck was modified to hold a larger crew and heavier ammunition. And of course, a new flag, a new identity. But why the name? Queen Anne's Revenge. A clear message, and not without political fire. Edward Teach had once served under the British flag during Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713. A war that dragged England, France, and Spain into a brutal colonial conflict. After the Treaty of Utrecht, England lost many of its territories. Anne, the last queen of the House of Stuart, was overthrown, replaced by the Protestant Hanover line. Many sailors, especially those with Catholic or Jacobite sympathies, saw this as a betrayal. Maybe Teach did too. Queen Anne's Revenge wasn't just a name, it was a symbol of the old order, of the anger of those who'd been cast aside, of piracy as a political statement. And Teach? He simply declared himself Commodore. With up to 300 men on board, pirates, ex-soldiers, press-ganged Frenchmen, the Queen Anne's Revenge became the largest pirate ship in the Western Hemisphere. She was fast, heavily armed, and absolutely terrifying. It wasn't until 1996 that the wreck was rediscovered. Nearly 300,000 artifacts have been recovered so far. Cannons, anchors, tools, even personal belongings of the crew. Proof of the violence, the glory, and the legend of one of piracy's most notorious ships. From a slave ship to a warship. From La Concorde to a legend. With the Queen Anne's Revenge, Teach finally became Blackbeard, commander of his own little fleet, which now included a newly captured ship, the Adventure, an 80-ton logwood trader originally from Jamaica. The ship's captain was a man named David Harriet, who, like so many, willingly joined Blackbeard after the capture. Teach appointed Israel Hands, one of his closest confidants, as captain of the Adventure. Hands was experienced, loyal, and known for his toughness, but also for being touchy when it came to honor and power. His relationship with Teach was close, but not always peaceful. In a later argument, Teach supposedly even shot him, just to prove his authority. The bullet hit Hands in the knee. According to legend, Teach just said dryly, "If I don't hurt my own men, they forget who I am." Harriet, meanwhile, stayed on board, for now. By the spring of 1718, Edward Teach was at the peak of his power, commanding a mighty flagship, several escort ships, a loyal and ruthless crew, and an image that sent shivers down the spines, even of sailors on warships. Chapter 4. The Shadow over Charleston. On the night before the blockade of Charleston, Blackbeard's crew camped in a sheltered bay just south of the city. The men were exhausted, many suffering from fevers, diarrhea, joint pain, venereal disease, and general weakness, all typical after long voyages, with no fresh water, spoiled food, and little to no hygiene. To recover, they lit a campfire. The rum was passed around, partly to ease their pain. As they sat there, surrounded by insects, stifling air, and just the faintest breeze, something happened, something casual, that would later become a defining part of Blackbeard's image. Edward Teach, already feared as a pirate by this point, stuck a few saltpeter-soaked fuses, so-called slow matches, into his long braided beard. These matches were usually used to light cannons. They burned slowly, steadily, and gave off thick, choking smoke. According to later accounts from the crew, the mood that night was almost cheerful. One crewman supposedly shouted when he saw him, "He looks like the devil himself, just risen from hell." What started as a spontaneous joke apparently struck Teach as a clever tactical idea. The very next day, during the blockade of Charlestown, he used this act on purpose. Several smoldering fuses stuck visibly in his beard and under his hat, a creepy cloud of smoke swirling around his head, multiple pistols strapped across his chest, and a cutlass in hand. This wasn't random. It was deliberate psychological warfare. The goal: to intimidate his enemies before a single shot was fired. Historians believe Teach knew exactly what he was doing. Authors like Angus Constam and Bennerson Little even call it an early form of branding, a way to cement his image as a terrifying leader. Some also speculate the fuses weren't just for intimidation. Smoke in the Caribbean was a tried and true way to keep mosquitoes and other insects at bay. It's possible Blackbeard first noticed the practical effect and then turned it into a strategic performance. Either way, from that moment on, Blackbeard wasn't just a pirate. He became a symbol of chaos, smoke, and violence. By May of 1718, Charleston, South Carolina was a wealthy port city, and suddenly the target of a brazen pirate move. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, showed up at the harbor entrance with a small fleet and drew the metaphorical dagger, a full blockade of the city. For days, his ships, including the mighty Queen Anne's Revenge, sat anchored strategically. No ship got in. No ship got out. Merchant vessels were seized, supplies were confiscated, and passengers were taken hostage. Among them, a city councilman and his little entourage. Charming, right? And what did Blackbeard demand for their release? Not millions, not gold, but a modest delivery of medicine, mostly mercury, the standard remedy for syphilis at the time. The message was clear. Not just Blackbeard, but apparently his crew too had some, let's say, medical needs. The city officials, completely overwhelmed, agreed to the deal. After more than a week of panic and paralysis, the requested medicine and a small boat were handed over. Charleston breathed a sigh of relief, and Blackbeard sailed away satisfied. Not a single shot fired, no blood spilled, just an entire city held hostage, and a pirate with a freshly stocked medicine chest. But behind that dramatic display, there was a more serious problem. The Queen Anne's Revenge was no longer the unstoppable monster it once was. Her proud silhouette was deceiving. Technically speaking, the ship was in rough shape. The rudder had been damaged multiple times and handled sluggishly, like an old wagon at sea. The hull was covered in barnacles and algae, slowing her down considerably. Several of the cannons were broken, and the deck, weakened by moisture and battles, had grown rotten. And to make matters worse, there were leaks. Poorly patched and prone to letting water back in whenever the seas got rough. In short, the Queen Anne's Revenge was hurting, and Teach knew it. After the blockade, the fleet pulled back, heading north. What exactly happened in the days between leaving Charleston and the eventual wreck isn't fully recorded. But a lot points to a mix of strategy, distrust, and good old maritime improvisation. We do know the fleet was reorganized. Some ships were abandoned, others redistributed. Stede Bonnet, now recovered, was back with the group, but his role? Unclear. He seemed more like a guest than a captain. Blackbeard, on the other hand, already seemed to be working on a new plan: to cut ties with his oversized fleet. Why? Maybe to keep control, maybe to avoid sharing the loot, or maybe simply because his flagship was closer to the ocean floor than to glory. What is certain is this: Blackbeard set course for Topsail Inlet, and the next turning point in his story was just a few nautical miles away. Chapter 5. Sand in the Gears. Topsail Inlet, today known as Beaufort Inlet, was a twisted, treacherous stretch of coastline off North Carolina. Shallow waters, sandbanks, unpredictable currents. And it was here, in June of 1718, that Blackbeard dropped anchor with his fleet. Officially, the story was simple. They needed a break, and supplies had to be restocked. But what happened next still feels like a calculated move or an incredible accident. Maybe both. First, the Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground. The proud 40-gun ship had been through hell in the past months, its rudder badly damaged, its hull battered, its deck leaking. It simply wasn't seaworthy anymore. And when it got stuck in the inlet shallows, it didn't seem like an accident. Shortly after, the Adventure, a smaller, more maneuverable ship commanded by Israel Hands, tried to assist and also ran aground. But unlike the Queen Anne's Revenge, she wasn't beyond saving. The ship was refloated not long after. Blackbeard, Israel Hands, and a hand-picked group of loyal followers took off aboard the Adventure, with most of the loot. The rest of the crew was left behind, stranded on the wrecks or ashore. Among them, David Harriet, the former captain of the Adventure, and parts of Stede Bonnet's old crew. Bonnet himself wasn't there. He was likely on land or on another ship. By the time he learned of the grounding, the situation was already decided. David Harriet, an experienced navigator and former captain of an 8-gun logwood transporter, later testified in court that Teach deliberately ran the Queen Anne's Revenge aground to shrink his fleet get rid of troublesome or suspicious men, and disappear with the most valuable treasure. This version was backed up by Ignatius Pell, Bonnet's boatswain. He too was convinced. That was no navigational mistake. That was strategy. Whether that's really what happened remains disputed to this day. Some historians believe Blackbeard deliberately bet on the weakness of the Queen Anne's Revenge. The ship was overloaded, sluggish, and damaged. A clean loss gave him the chance to start fresh, with loyal men and a seaworthy ship. The fact that Teach seemed to know exactly where the dangerous sandbanks were makes the theory even more convincing. Bonnet, now recovered, took in the stranded men, including Harriet, and tried to chase Blackbeard down, but failed. Instead, he went back to piracy. Under the new name Royal James, the sloop formerly known as Revenge set out once again to raid and plunder. But in South Carolina, patience was running out. The authorities had had enough of the pirate plague. Colonel William Rhett was ordered to outfit 2 armed sloops, originally to hunt down Charles Vane. But instead, they ran into Bonnet. In September 1718 at Cape Fear, the battle began. Rhett versus Bonnet. It was a lopsided fight. Bonnet didn't stand a chance. His Royal James was captured and his crew taken prisoner. David Harriet survived the fight, and once again, his word carried weight. In the following trial, he testified against Bonnet and got his sentence reduced in return. But the story took one last turn. Not long after, Bonnet escaped prison with help from the shady merchant Richard Tuckerman, along with Harriet. They fled into the swamps of Sullivan's Island, but were caught there. Harriet and 2 others were shot during the escape attempt. Bonnet survived, was captured again, and finally hanged in December 1718. By then, Teach had already moved on. While his former comrades rotted in dungeons or died in the swamps, he had settled in the small town of Bath, North Carolina officially, because now he'd been pardoned. Governor Charles Eden, whose relationship with Teach was likely more than just political, granted him a royal pardon. Some believe Eden profited from Teach's loot and connections. After all, pirate gold was good for business in the region. And then, things got even stranger. In the summer of 1718, Blackbeard got married. Mary Ormond, about 16 years old, the daughter of a wealthy plantation owner, became his bride. Was it love or just strategy? That is anyone's guess. But the detail that really got people talking. The ceremony was reportedly performed by Governor Eden himself. A governor marrying off a pirate? Welcome to the colonial Caribbean. But as domestic as it all sounded, Teach was not a man for quiet married life in a safe harbor. His craving for wind, gunpowder, and freedom ran far too deep. And so, it didn't take long before he set sail again, heading straight for his final battle. Chapter 6. The End of the Devil of the Sea. November 22nd, 1718. Ocracoke Inlet, North Carolina. A heavy gray fog clings to the water. Visibility is terrible. At anchor lies the Adventure, a sloop armed with 4 swivel guns. On board, around 20 to 25 men, and their captain, Edward Teach. The British mission, Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia, has had enough of the reports about the infamous pirate. Without official permission from North Carolina, he outfits 2 armed sloops with about 57 men in total, the Jane and the Ranger, commanded by Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy. The goal? Eliminate Blackbeard. No trial, no negotiations. Just one order. Kill him. Dawn. Maynard blocks the channel, cutting off any chance of escape, and drops anchor near the island at Ocracoke Inlet. The narrow passage, the sandbanks, the thick fog, all work in his favor. At first light, he gives the order to attack. Because of the fog, Blackbeard doesn't spot the ships until they're already close. The first volley. Blackbeard reacts first. He fires a broadside from his swivel guns. The blast tears through the Jane's deck. Between 8 and 12 British sailors die instantly. Maynard's men are badly shaken, but Maynard has a plan. He orders a tactical retreat to the lower deck. Only a small group stays above. Blackbeard assumes his enemy is nearly finished. The bait works. Teach gives the order to board. Together with about 15 men, he personally boards the Jane. His thick black beard, laced with glowing fuses, several loaded pistols strapped across his chest, and in his hand, a heavy cutlass. The scene is like something out of a nightmare. Smoke, screams, the crunch of boots on splintered wood, and suddenly, from below deck, the surviving British soldiers charge. Close combat, chaos, hell. On deck, Blackbeard fires first. Maynard takes a shot to the chest, but it's not fatal. He stays on his feet, takes aim, and hits Teach in the shoulder. The joint shatters. Teach staggers, catches himself, and keeps coming. He's wounded, but unstoppable. Sabers clash with bayonets, pistols, cutlasses, daggers. Blood stains the planks. The fog mixes with the smoke. The fighters trip over ropes and corpses. Blackbeard fights like a berserker. He kills 2 men with his bare hands before facing Maynard again. In a brutal sword fight, Blackbeard shatters Maynard's blade with a single blow. Then, he wrestles the officer to the ground. Maynard, defeated, stares up, ready to meet his end. Blackbeard raises his sword, ready to deliver the final strike. But then, the unexpected. A young Scottish sailor intervenes. With a short seaman's blade, he drives it up into Teach's throat, below the jaw. Artery, windpipe, muscle, all severed. And still, Blackbeard does not fall. He fights on, stumbling, slashing wildly. The wounds add up. 5 gunshots, more than 20 cuts. Only when blood drips from his beard, his knees give way, and his gaze empties, does he finally sink to the deck. Edward Teach is dead. The aftermath. Maynard, wounded himself, orders Blackbeard's head to be cut off. His head is fastened to the bowsprit of the Jane as proof and as a warning. His body is thrown into the sea. Later, his head is displayed above the Hampton River in Virginia, a macabre triumph, but a necessary one, because no one wanted to believe that Blackbeard was mortal. Israel Hands. Blackbeard's lieutenant was not on board. He'd been shot, supposedly by Teach himself, as a lesson, and was recovering in Bath on the day of the battle. He was arrested there, brought to Williamsburg, and testified against other pirates, and even against Blackbeard's political allies. His fate? Unclear. Some say he lived out his days in poverty in London. Others believe he disappeared and survived. What remains? With Blackbeard's death, not just a man ended, but an entire era. The golden age of piracy faded, and yet the legend lives on, in songs, in stories, and in nightmares. Because his death was not an end. It was a thunderstrike in the history of the sea. Chapter 7. Myth and Reality. Who was Blackbeard really? Edward Teach. Blackbeard, the devil of the sea. To some, he was a monster, a demonic pirate with a burning beard and a devilish stare. To others, he was a strategic pirate, a master of theater who understood fear is a weapon, and those who are feared rarely have to fight. But what was real, and what was myth? The myth. Hollywood, novels, and sailors' tall tales turned Teach into a figure of terror, a giant, said to stand over 2 meters tall, with glowing fuses in his beard, who struck fear into entire crews as he boarded. Supposedly unbeatable, immortal, even superhuman. They say he married 14 women, drank the blood of his enemies, and challenged the devil himself to an arm wrestling match. Some legends claim that after he was beheaded, he still walked the deck several times. Headless, of course. Sounds wild? That's because it is. But what remains when you clear the fog? The reality. Edward Teach was no mindless butcher, but likely a well-read man. He could read and write, had nautical knowledge, and understood the art of political alliances. In Nassau, he was part of a network of pirates, smugglers, and governors. His greatest weapon was theater. He wore black clothes, heavy bandoliers, and burning fuses in his beard. His appearance was a spectacle, part theater, part threat, and it worked. Many captains surrendered before a single shot was fired. But Blackbeard was no mass murderer. There are very few credible reports of him executing hostages or killing civilians. He plundered, yes, but often efficiently, deliberately, with minimal bloodshed. A gentleman of intimidation, if you will. The treasure, truth or curse. And then, of course, there's the question of all questions. Where is Blackbeard's treasure? Many tales claim the pirate buried vast amounts of gold, silver, and gemstones somewhere along the coasts of North Carolina, maybe even in the Bahamas. Entire expeditions have been launched to find it. So far, no luck. But did that treasure really exist? The fact is, in just 2 years as a pirate, Teach captured several £100,000 sterling, worth millions today. But he didn't live lavishly. There are no records of extravagant spending, no palaces, no overflowing wealth. Some historians believe he really did hide his treasure, planning to reclaim it one day, but he never got the chance. Others think he simply shared most of it with his men, or invested in portable wealth, rum, weapons, slaves, medicine. The remains of the Queen Anne's Revenge, found in 1996 off the coast of North Carolina, did hold something. Weapons, tools, coins, but no gold, no treasure chests. Maybe the real treasure was just his myth, and that endures to this day. The Pirate and His Legacy. Blackbeard's career was short, barely 2 years. And yet, his name lives on. Why? Because he was the perfect mix of reality and legend. Because he came at just the right time, at the end of the golden age of piracy. Because his death was dramatic enough to make him immortal. He became an icon, a symbol of freedom, of chaos, and of the end of a brutal yet fascinating chapter in history. Myth meets man. Maybe Edward Teach was never the monster he was made out to be. Maybe he was a man of anger, longing, courage, and fear. Maybe he was tired when Maynard came. But one thing is certain. He was a master of his craft, a pirate with brains, a showman who knew sometimes all it takes is a burning beard to write history. What do you think? Does Blackbeard's treasure still exist somewhere out there? Or was his greatest treasure just his reputation? Drop your theories in the comments below. We can't wait to read them. If you enjoyed this journey through Blackbeard's life, leave a like. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with your crew, or else we can't guarantee that the ghost of Edward Teach won't come haunting you too. And don't forget to ring the bell so you don't miss any stories from the depths of the past.